All right, our story today is about Nehemiah. You know, there are two books in the Bible that are about what's happening now. One was Ezra and one is Nehemiah, and they tell about what happened when they went back to Jerusalem. Now, we're going to put Nehemiah here because he worked for the king. And let's look over here. You see this fancy table setting? Whoa, isn't that gorgeous? And gold rimmed dishes and beautiful metal things. This is the king, and the king is very wealthy. And one of the jobs that Nehemiah had was to bring the food to the king. He was called the cupbearer. So let's put the king on his throne, King Artaxerxes. He's on his throne. And the particular story we're going to tell about today said the queen was there too. So I'm going to put the queen over here. Actually, she was sitting down, but I don't have a seat for her, so we'll put her there. And there's Nehemiah. And Nehemiah would come in, and of course, you're going to serve food. You probably need a table. So we're going to put a table there. And the king, you know, in those days, the king had to be careful because maybe there'd be someone trying to get him. So he had guards. And you know, our president today, he has what they call the Secret Service. And they go with they don't have uniforms on, they have suits on. But they'll be always standing around the president watching. Be sure no harm will come to him. And we'll put some food on the table. We'll pretend that they're getting ready to eat. Well, now let's go to the story. That's kind of setting it up for the story. And the story is in the book of Nehemiah. And this story happened about 150 years after Daniel and his friends were brought to Babylon. Many of the people after 70 years went back to Jerusalem, but not everybody did. And some stayed. And then we came to Queen Esther and how the king that she was living then had planned to have the people killed, and then they were saved. Queen Esther pled for them. And then we come to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Ezra was already in Jerusalem. And then that's hundreds of miles away. And he says, in a certain month, he said, Hanani, one of my brethren, came. And I said, how are things going in Jerusalem? And you know what he said? Terrible. He said, the walls are still down, the gates are still burned from when Nebuchadnezzar was there, and it looks awful. Now it's true, they did build the temple, but here, Jerusalem was on a hill. So when you went up there, what would you see? You wouldn't see a beautiful wall. It was all broken down like, does anybody live here? And it upset Nehemiah so much, he said he just sat down and wept. He was so sad. Now, you know, many cities in Europe, we talked about Europe, many cities in Europe, you can go and visit and they'll show you how it was torn down. They probably have mowed that, otherwise it had been grown up with grass and maybe even trees. But let me show you how the way it was to start with. This is the way it was before. Now, you see the difference? See how nice that was? And now it's all torn down. And that may have been the way the walls were, torn down. Now, I think the rocks were still around there because they got the work done fairly quickly. So I think it was just a matter of picking up the rocks and putting them where they belonged. But that's heavy work. They didn't have any forklifts, they didn't have any cranes, they didn't have any bobcats, they didn't have any bulldozers. They had muscles, maybe they used animals, they may have had some kind of lifts and pulleys and ramps, but it was hard work because rocks are heavy, as you know. Well, anyway, so poor Nebuchadnezzar, he's thinking about it and praying about it, and it was quite a while, several weeks. And finally he decided he was going to talk to the king about it. But he wasn't sure how to do it. He had been praying and asking God to help him. So he says, one day I took the food to the king, and I'd never been sad before, he says. And today he looked so worried and sad. The king looked at him and said, is something wrong, Nehemiah? You don't look well. He said, but I don't think you're sick, are you? He said, you must be upset about something. And Nehemiah kind of got afraid because maybe the king thought he had heard that someone wanted to kill him, and Nehemiah was concerned about that, but it wasn't that. So he said, oh, king, he said, may you live forever. He said, why shouldn't my face be sad? My city, the city of my family, where all my family is buried, is in ruins. It lies waste, and the gates are burned with fire. So you know what the king said? He said, what would you like me to do? And so he said, I prayed immediately to God. You remember Miss Sonia says you don't have to kneel down and pray all the time. Wherever you are, if you need the Lord, you can pray. And that's what he did. And he asked the Lord to help him to what to say. And so here's what he said. He said, if it pleases the king, I would like to go to Jerusalem. Remember, that's hundreds of miles away. And help my brethren there. And so the king says, well, how long will you be gone? And he gave him a time. Actually, he was gone for a long time. He was gone for years. He may not have planned to be gone that long. So he also said, we need some timber. Remember the gates? And so the king said, you can have it. He said, and would you give me letters so that the countries and the lands I pass through, if they say, why are you coming? What are you doing here? I'll have a letter from the king that has given me permission. And the king said, it will be done. And not only that, the king said, I'll send a guard with you so you don't have to worry. So he had everything and more than he had asked for, so he went on his way. So when he finally got to Nehemiah, all the people probably said, oh, who's that? And maybe he had nice clothes on. He was from the king. Maybe the guards were there. People were looking, oh, what's going on? He didn't say anything. He just looked around, kind of got a feel for what the city looked like. And after 3 days, he and just a very few other men at night, he took an animal, maybe it was they put that over there, and he rode around the city at night. He went from, he said, the fish gate to the king's quarters he named all the places, just like if we went around here, we'd say, we went to the third house, and then to the school, and then over to the gas station, and just talked how he went around the city, and he saw what needed to be done. And then he called the people together, and what do you think he told them? He told them, we're going to build. Well, it wasn't going to be particularly easy. For one thing, it was hard work. For the other thing, there were 3 men. They weren't from Judah. They were Samaritans, and they didn't like the Jews. And their names were, the Bible has their names, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And they started saying, what do you think you're doing? You're not going to be able to do this. And Nehemiah said, pay them no mind. And so he said, all right, we're going to divide it up. Now remember, parts of it weren't as bad as others. So he said one person, and he names their names. He must have written it all down, because he names for instance, he says, let me start at the beginning. He said, Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brethren, and they built the sheep gate, consecrated and hung the gates. And then they went to the Tower of the 100, and then they went to someone else's place, and everybody had a part of the building. So if you were living then, and your parents helped, they'd have your name in there too. And so he named them all, how far they went and what their job was. He and Ezra kept very careful records. Well, they got about halfway there, and who comes along but Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem? And they started saying, oh, what do you think you are? You're just old, weak Jews. Will they strengthen themselves? Do they think they can do that? If a fox ran over and knock it down. They were just making fun of them. But Nehemiah said, don't pay them any mind. And finally they said, well, we're going to get some people to fight against you. And so then, you know what he said? He said, we're going to set guards day and night. They set guards to guard the city. Here's a picture. You see how they're building? This is one artist's picture. They have some pulleys there to pull up the rocks. And there they're guarding. Maybe that's Nehemiah keeping watch. Some had the tools to work with. Some had spears and swords, and I think it said bows and arrows too. They were going to guard the city. They were going to get this work done. and they knew that God would bless them. So they worked on. Well, then Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem sent word to Nehemiah, and they said, we want to talk to you. Let's go down and talk. And they said, we want to meet with you. And you know the name of the place that they were going to meet? Oops, daisy. They're going to meet. This is it. See if you can. They said, let's meet at the place. Oh no, it was kind of like in a plane outside the city, and you know why they wanted him to go there. You know what he said? He said, oh no, I'm not going to, oh no, you're not going to get me going there. And they kept on working. And whatever Sanballat and Geshem tried to do, Nehemiah said, we're going to work. This is the Lord's work. And let me read you, this is your memory verse, by the way. Let me read you what they said. This is Nehemiah 2:20. And so this is what Nehemiah said, but all the people, he said, when Sanballat and Geshem and Tobiah laughed at it and said, what do you think you're doing? He said, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. You think you could say that? Let's try it again. Let's do some actions with it. The God of heaven himself will help us, so we will arise and build. You try that. Let's do it one more time. Let's do it together. The God of heaven himself will prosper us, and therefore we will arise and build. They weren't going to let anything stop them. Do you ever have trouble at home wanting to do something, having to do something, there's a bunch of toys on the floor and you don't feel like picking them up? Maybe you should say something like that. No, whatever we need to do, God gives us strength to do it. And we have to have a willing heart. And that's the way they were there, weren't they? They had a willing heart. Now, you know, you're going to read more about this in your lesson. There's more involved. I can't even cover the whole story. But after I wanted to show you how long it took for them to get it done. Now, this was in the summertime. They did it, because I looked up the names of the months. They aren't the same as ours. So let's say they started in July. They worked all of July. It was probably warm, but maybe the boys and girls brought food and helped in the garden and did things that they could do to help. So they went through all of July, and about the third week in August, they were done. It was 52 weeks, not even 2 months. Isn't that amazing? Because the God of heaven himself helped us. They arose and built, and they got it done in less than 2 months. That was amazing, especially with the tools and all they had. So they were very thankful for that. And then when it was all over, let me find something else here. Here it is. When it was all over, what do you think they did? They had a celebration. They're going to have a feast. We're going to celebrate, get the choirs ready. And then Ezra. Now, this is just a small sample of it. Normally, it's in a big container. But, you know, they said they read from the book. But the book wasn't a book like we know, was it? It was scrolls. But the scroll was much bigger. This is just a small sample. And they probably kept them in large containers made of clay, because that would keep them dry, wouldn't it? And you know how they open the scroll and they start reading? They read the opposite from us. They read from right to left. And they read about what Moses had said and how they should keep the law and all these things that are in the Bible. And probably they read from the Psalms too, the Psalms of David. And so all the people, they heard, oh my, we've not been doing a lot of things right. And little by little, with Ezra and Nehemiah leading them, they wanted to follow the law, because they could see how God had blessed them. And he will help us too when we want to do what's right. We can ask him for it to help us. And so don't forget that when you have jobs at home. You be like Nehemiah and all those people whose names are written in the Bible, that they helped. There was one family that was mentioned that didn't help so much. Their name was Tekoas. And so that wasn't so good. That's a shame, isn't it? That someone didn't help and their name was put down. That happens sometimes. Well, anyway, that's the story of Nehemiah and how they arose and built and how God blessed them. And they had a wonderful celebration in the fall when it was all done. Now, do you remember that song? What was the name of it? If you said, I'm in the Lord's army, You're exactly right. And why do you think I had to pick that song? Because when we work for God, the Lord's our general, your parents are the captains, and we're in the Lord's army, yes sir, and we want to work. So maybe when you're picking up your blocks, or maybe when you're doing the dishes, cleaning off the table, or helping in the garden, you can sing. Actually, I have found singing helps the time go quickly. You can use those little vocal cords we talked about. So now I'm going to play it again, and this time if you know it, sing it. Well, I hope you know it, and you be part of the Lord's army. Now, I think it's time for missions.